My coworker had been calling my husband our husband for nearly 2 months before I finally admitted to myself that it was not a joke anymore. At first, I treated it like one because that was easier than confronting how deeply wrong it felt. My husband Harrison and I had been married for 14 months, and he worked from home as an architect. That meant he was usually the one who dropped off lunch when I forgot it and picked me up after late shifts, and appeared at office events with the kind of easy warmth that made people like him immediately. He remembered birthdays, repaired the office coffee machine when it broke, and once brought enough homemade banana bread for the entire floor because I had mentioned that everyone was working through a difficult deadline. My coworkers adored him, and I was proud of that. Then Sabine, one of the women on my team, went through a divorce in March, and her behavior toward Harrison changed so gradually that I kept finding ways to excuse it. When he brought me lunch and included extra sandwiches for the team, she would linger beside my desk and tell me how thoughtful he was, how her ex-husband had never done anything like that, and how lucky I was. When Harrison fixed the coffee machine with his sleeves rolled up, she stood nearby, commenting on his arms and saying she needed a man who was capable like him. Harrison always became visibly uncomfortable. He would give me a tight smile, say he had a deadline, and leave much faster than he normally would. The first time Sabine called him our husband, Harrison had texted to say he was bringing coffee. She leaned over my desk, read the notification, and laughed. Our husband is so sweet. I laughed too, mostly because everyone else did, but something in my stomach tightened. The next time Harrison was helping me carry boxes to my car, and Sabine announced, "Look at our husband being useful." I told her directly that it was not funny. She rolled her eyes and said we were basically work wives, so sharing came with the territory. "We share a printer," I said. "We do not share a husband." She smiled as though I had made the joke better. After that, her behavior stopped being limited to comments. Our company used a shared calendar for scheduling, and whenever Harrison and I blocked off time for dinner, a market, or an appointment, Sabine somehow knew. She would message me asking where we were going and whether she could come. If I ignored her, she sometimes appeared anyway. She showed up at restaurants at the farmer's market and once during a quiet anniversary walk along the river, claiming each time that she had just happened to be nearby. When we tried slipping away, she would wave and call after us that she only wanted to say hello to our husband. Harrison and I turned off the location sharing I had used with coworkers because we suspected she was checking it. At an office drinks night after a quarterly review, I had a little too much wine and called Harrison for a ride. Sabine grabbed my phone from my hand, held it out of reach when I tried to take it back, and started telling him about her dating life as though they were close friends. She laughed and told me I should teach him to handle girl talk about our husband. Harrison went silent on the other end. After that night, he began avoiding my office completely. When he had to come by, he stayed for less than 5 minutes. Sabine still followed him toward the elevator, and more than once I caught her watching the lobby camera feed on her monitor as if she were waiting for him to appear. I should have gone to HR then. I should have documented every comment, every unexpected appearance, and every time Harrison said she made him uneasy. Instead, I kept thinking that Sabine was lonely, embarrassed by her divorce, and trying too hard to feel included. Looking back, I understand that my politeness gave her room to keep testing the boundary. The first moment I could no longer explain away happened on our anniversary. Harrison came to surprise me and take me to lunch while I was in a meeting. My closest work friend Kendra sent me a message that said, "Your husband is here, but something strange is happening." I left the conference room so quickly that I barely remembered to close the door behind me. Sabine was sitting at my desk, in my chair, wearing the spare blazer I kept folded in a drawer. Harrison was backed against the cubicle wall, with the trapped expression of someone trying to stay polite while looking for an escape. I demanded to know what she was doing. Sabine stood slowly and smoothed the front of my blazer, as though it belonged to her. "I was showing our husband what it would look like if I worked closer to him," she said. I told her to take off my clothes, get out of my chair, and move away from Harrison. She replied that it was an open office, and that he had not seemed to mind sitting with her. Harrison's voice was tight when he corrected her. He said he had told her repeatedly that he was waiting for his wife, and that she had sat in my chair and spoken to him as if the two of them were a couple. Sabine shrugged and said that leaving my chair empty was practically an invitation. I went to HR that afternoon. I explained the comments, the stalking behavior, and the incident with my blazer. The representative I spoke to said that because Sabine had not touched Harrison and nothing overtly physical had happened, it sounded like an interpersonal conflict that the two of us should try to resolve professionally. I asked to be moved to another floor. They promised to look into it, but 2 days passed without an answer. Harrison told me he would not come to the office anymore. "Last time she was wearing your clothes," he said. "What is she going to do next?" I understood why he was frightened, but it still hurt. Something kind and ordinary in our marriage, him bringing lunch, meeting me after work, surprising me on our anniversary, had been poisoned by a woman who behaved as though my relationship were a public resource. The next violation was worse. I returned from lunch and found Sabine at my computer. I had stepped away for less than 10 minutes and stupidly left it unlocked. She had opened a folder containing photographs from our honeymoon. None were explicit, but they were private, intimate memories that belonged to Harrison and me. Sabine looked over her shoulder and said, "Ours." I told her to get away from my computer. She smiled and said Harrison looked good in the pictures and that she had sent several to herself. When I said I was reporting her, she calmly asked what proof I had. The photographs were already on her phone, she said, and she could claim Harrison had sent them to her himself. She told me people might believe the friendly coworker over the jealous wife. Then I noticed another window open on my screen. It was an email draft addressed to Harrison, written in my account, but not by me. The message said I was ending our marriage and included cruel remarks about him that I would never have written. Sabine admitted she had composed it, then told me not to worry because she had not sent it yet. She also said she knew my password and warned me against using the same one for everything. I changed my passwords that afternoon and started locking my computer every time I stood up, even if I was only turning around to speak to someone. I photographed the fake email before deleting it, but I still had not fully grasped how much access she had gained. The following morning, a sticky note was waiting on my monitor. It read, "A locked screen will not keep me from our husband. Check your phone." There was a text in my sent messages, time-stamped 4 in the morning, addressed to Harrison. It said, "We need to talk. Coming to your office today. We have something to tell you. Love, S." I had been asleep at 4. My phone had been on the nightstand beside me all night. Harrison had replied, asking who S was, why she was coming to our house, and what was happening. I called him immediately. He did not answer. Sabine's chair was empty, her bag was gone, and she had left the office more than an hour earlier. Our house was 25 minutes away. By the time I understood what she had done, she could already have been standing at our door. I tried calling Harrison 4 times, and every call went straight to voicemail. The office around me suddenly felt unbearably loud. Keyboards clicked, phones rang, and people laughed in the break room while I paced between my cubicle and the hallway, gripping my phone so tightly that my fingers hurt. I could not stop imagining what Sabine might be telling him. She had copied our photographs, written a false breakup message, and sent a text that made it sound as though she and I were arriving together with some shared revelation. The word "we" terrified me most. She was writing herself into my marriage as though she belonged there. Kendra came out of the conference room and stopped when she saw my face. I explained the fake message, Sabine's empty desk, and Harrison's silence so quickly that I could barely breathe between sentences. Kendra went pale. Then, with obvious guilt, she admitted that Sabine had been acting even more strangely than I knew. She had seen her standing at my desk when I was in meetings, touching my belongings and opening drawers. She had heard her talking to herself about Harrison in the bathroom. The week before, Kendra had caught her trying on my blazer in an empty conference room while staring at her reflection in the dark glass. She had started keeping dated notes because the behavior frightened her, but she had not told me because she did not want to create drama. I was angry for half a second, then realized I had made the same mistake. We had both treated danger as awkwardness because acknowledging the truth would have required action. I told Kendra I was going home immediately, even though I had a client presentation that afternoon. My hands were shaking too badly for me to drive safely, so she grabbed her keys, told our manager we had a family emergency, and drove while I kept calling Harrison. Every red light felt personal. I stared at the highway exits and reread the false message until the words blurred. At one stop, Kendra showed me the notes on her phone. She had recorded dates and times when Sabine watched the lobby cameras, stood at my empty desk, appeared after I mentioned plans with Harrison, or made comments about sharing everything. Seeing the pattern laid out chronologically changed something in me. This was no longer a collection of uncomfortable moments. It was a campaign that had been escalating for weeks. About 20 minutes into the drive, Harrison finally texted. He wrote that my coworker was standing in our driveway and telling our neighbor I had sent her to check on him because I believed he was depressed. He asked where I was and said the situation felt insane. I responded immediately, explaining that Sabine had taken control of my phone, sent the message without permission, and left the office before I realized what she had done. I told him I was on my way and begged him not to let her inside. His reply came after a long pause. "She is being completely calm and reasonable. That is somehow making this worse." Of course she was calm. Sabine was always calm when she was doing the most disturbing things. She had been calm in my blazer calm while copying my photographs, and calm while admitting she knew my password. Her composure was not evidence that she was harmless. It was how she made everyone else doubt their instincts. Kendra insisted we pull into a gas station long enough to preserve everything before confronting Sabine. She was right. I took screenshots of the 4 in the morning message, the earlier messages where Sabine called Harrison our husband, the photograph I had taken of the sticky note, and the image of the fake breakup email. Kendra helped organize them into a dated folder and added her own timeline. We labeled every screenshot and backed the folder up so Sabine could not erase it by getting into my phone again. Then we continued home, reviewing the sequence aloud so neither of us would be confused when we arrived. The jokes, the unwanted appearances, the office party, the blazer, the stolen honeymoon photographs, the false email, the sticky note, the fraudulent text, and now the visit to my house. 10 minutes later, we turned onto my street and saw Sabine's car parked crookedly across part of the driveway. Harrison stood on the porch with his arms folded. Our next-door neighbor Lionel was watching from his lawn with a deep frown. Sabine stood on our front path with her hands clasped, wearing a neat cardigan and speaking in a soft, concerned voice. She looked so normal that, from a distance, I could understand why someone might believe her. The instant she saw me get out of Kendra's car, her expression changed. The warmth disappeared and something hard settled across her face. Several neighbors were outside. One was watering plants and another had stopped walking her dog. Sabine raised her voice so they could hear. "I am glad you finally got here, Corinne. We need to have an honest conversation with Harrison, don't we?" The way she said "we" made it sound as though we had planned the visit together. I told her she had not been invited and needed to leave immediately. She tilted her head and claimed that Harrison had been happy to see her and that they had discussed all the problems in our marriage. Harrison stepped down from the porch and came to stand beside me. He said he had asked her to leave at least 5 times and that she had refused, insisting she was worried about me and needed to make sure he was all right. Lionel then said he had come outside because he had seen Sabine peering through our windows before Harrison opened the door. That detail changed the mood instantly. Kendra pulled out her phone and showed Harrison and Lionel the evidence. She explained that Sabine had followed us for months, entered my computer, stolen private photographs, written a false breakup email, and sent a fraudulent text from my phone. Lionel stepped farther away from Sabine as he read. Her calm began to fracture. She claimed I had spent weeks complaining about Harrison at work and saying I regretted marrying him. She looked directly at him and said I had sent her to break the news because I was too cowardly to do it myself. Harrison's face went pale. I opened the photographed draft email and handed him my phone. He read the cruel message Sabine had written in my account, then looked at her with a kind of anger I had never seen in him. "You wrote this?" he said. "You sat at her desk and tried to make me believe my wife wanted to leave me?" Sabine began talking faster, insisting that everyone misunderstood her and that she was the only person being honest. The more she spoke, the less reasonable she sounded. Harrison stepped slightly in front of me and told her clearly and without softness that whatever relationship she imagined between them had never existed. He ordered her to leave. A patrol car turned onto the street while the neighbors were still gathered. Lionel waved it down. He had called the non-emergency line after seeing Sabine looking through the windows, and the officer had arrived at exactly the right moment. Kendra showed him the screenshots and her notes. Harrison showed him the false email. Lionel described the window peeping and Sabine's refusal to leave. The officer's tone became firm. He told Sabine that she did not live there and had been asked to leave and needed to get off the property immediately. She crossed her arms and argued that the street was public and that he could not remove her for speaking to friends. The officer asked for her identification and began writing down her information. That was when she lost control. She shouted that I was turning everyone against her because I could not accept that Harrison preferred her. More neighbors drifted closer, and someone began recording on a phone. Sabine pointed at me and warned that every one of us would regret what we were doing. The officer stepped between us and ordered her into her car. She finally obeyed, but before slamming the door, she screamed that I had ruined everything. Her tires squealed as she drove away, and the patrol car followed long enough to make sure she left the neighborhood. The officer then returned to take statements. Harrison's hands shook as he explained that Sabine had arrived sounding concerned and friendly, then began mentioning details she had no legitimate way to know: the client he was designing for the coffee shop where he bought an afternoon espresso and the route he used for his morning runs. Those were not things I discussed openly at work. Harrison said she knew his schedule down to which days he ran near the reservoir. The officer gave us a case number, advised us to preserve every message, and told us to call immediately if Sabine returned or contacted either of us. Once we were inside, Harrison sat on the couch and put his head in his hands. He admitted that he had almost believed her at first because she sounded so sincere. Then she mentioned his Tuesday and Thursday run route, and he realized she had either been reading our private messages or following him. Lionel knocked a few minutes later to check on us and promised to watch the house. After he left, Harrison and I began checking every account connected to my phone and laptop. My email login history showed access from an unfamiliar device going back almost a month. My cloud storage showed the same device opening and downloading our photographs repeatedly. My social media accounts had also been accessed. Sabine had been reading private conversations with my family and friends, including messages where I described her behavior to Kendra. Then Harrison found a document in my cloud drive that I had never created. It was a detailed file about him, his work schedule, his running routes by day, the names of his friends, the coffee shop he visited, his usual order, his favorite restaurant, his sister's name, and where she lived. The entries went back 2 months, beginning shortly after Sabine's divorce. The final entry had been added that morning. It included the anniversary lunch Harrison had planned, information he had texted only to me the night before. She had read it, updated her file, and driven to our home. The organized nature of the document frightened me more than the shouting on the lawn. Sabine had not acted impulsively. She had been collecting Harrison's routines patiently while smiling at me across the office. She knew when he ran, where he worked, what he drank, and which family members mattered to him. Some of that information could only have come from my accounts. Other details suggested she had watched him in person. As evening settled in, Harrison and I realized neither of us felt safe staying alone in the house. I called my older sister Audra, who was completing a counseling program and had more experience than either of us with patterns of coercive and obsessive behavior. She listened without interrupting while I explained the visit, the police statement, the unauthorized logins, and the file about Harrison. When I finished, she told me that the behavior matched common stalking patterns and warned that people with an obsessive fixation often escalate when boundaries are imposed. She said she was driving over and instructed us to lock every door and window until she arrived. Harrison and I moved through the house, checking latches while every passing car made us tense. We left the lights on and kept our phones, laptops, screenshots, and the surveillance document spread across the kitchen table. Audra arrived a little over an hour later, hugged me, and immediately began organizing the evidence into a timeline. She explained that isolated incidents could be dismissed as misunderstandings, but a documented sequence showed escalation and intent. The progression was clear: possessive comments, following us in public, taking my phone, wearing my clothing, accessing my computer, stealing photographs, impersonating me, entering my accounts, studying Harrison's routine, and appearing at our home. Audra said the file demonstrated planning and advised us to make a formal police report in the morning, rather than relying only on the statement taken at the house. None of us slept properly. Around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a message from a newly created account. The profile had no photograph and no recognizable name. The message said, "This is not over. You will understand the truth eventually." I took a screenshot before blocking it. Harrison read it over my shoulder and pulled me close, but neither of us slept again. We lay awake until gray morning light filled the room, listening for movement outside and trying not to imagine Sabine standing somewhere beyond the windows. The next morning, Audra came with us to the police station. Kendra met us there, carrying her notes and copies of the screenshots. Detective Desmond Pike interviewed us in a small room and listened carefully as I told the story from the beginning. He asked for dates, times, locations, account records, and details about each time Sabine had appeared unexpectedly. I showed him the unfamiliar login history, the false text, the fake email, the honeymoon photograph she had copied, and the document cataloging Harrison's routine. His expression became more serious as he moved through the evidence. Kendra described what she had witnessed at the office and explained why she had started keeping notes. Harrison talked about the fear of discovering that someone he barely knew had tracked his runs, his work schedule, and the places he visited alone. Detective Pike told us that stalking cases were often difficult because a single event could be explained away, but our evidence showed an escalating pattern over 2 months. The unauthorized access to my accounts created a digital trail, and the surveillance file showed focused planning rather than awkward friendship. He said the material could support an application for a restraining order, although we would need to keep documenting everything. Every contact, every anonymous account, every appearance near our home, and every message mattered. He advised us to save originals, make backups, and write down incidents as soon as they happened. He also warned us carefully but directly that legal boundaries could sometimes trigger further escalation. The secrecy protecting Sabine had been removed, and she might react badly to being exposed. He gave us his direct number and told us to call if she appeared again. Before we left, he asked Harrison to list everything Sabine knew that she should not have known. He wanted to distinguish information obtained through unauthorized account access from details that might prove she had physically followed him. Hearing him explain the difference made the situation feel more real and more dangerous. We were not simply dealing with a coworker who had crossed a social line. We were documenting surveillance. On the way home, Harrison admitted that he no longer felt comfortable working alone in the house. We agreed that for the time being, he would use a library or a busy coffee shop during the day. Audra insisted on staying with us for several nights. When we returned, we walked through the property together and discovered that the latch on the back gate had been lifted, even though we always kept it closed. There was no way to prove when it happened, but the possibility that Sabine had already explored the yard made all 3 of us uneasy. We went to a hardware store and bought stronger deadbolts, a chain lock, a motion light, and a doorbell camera. Harrison and Audra installed everything, while I changed every password again. This time, using long random strings and enabling two-factor authentication. Audra created the cloud account for the camera under an email address Sabine did not know. So even if she somehow regained access to my devices, she would not know where the recordings were stored. We wrote a safety plan with a code word, emergency contacts, and rules for checking in. For the next several weeks, Harrison and I agreed not to go anywhere isolated alone, to keep our phones charged, and to share our locations only with each other, Audra, and Kendra. We trimmed bushes near the front windows and repaired loose latches. By sunset, our home looked almost the same from the street, but every lock and habit had changed. That night, at approximately 11, my phone displayed a motion alert. I opened the camera feed and saw Sabine standing on our front walk in the dark. She did not knock or ring the bell. She simply stared toward our bedroom window for almost 2 minutes before turning and walking away. We watched the clip 3 times in silence. She had returned the same night a police officer had ordered her away. I sent the recording to Detective Pike with a timestamp. He responded within minutes telling us to remain inside and keep the doors locked. A patrol car drove through the neighborhood several times that night. None of us slept. We sat in the living room watching the camera feed and jumping whenever headlights moved across the wall. The following morning, Audra helped me contact a legal aid clinic that handled harassment cases. Attorney Talia Serrano met with Harrison and me in a small conference room and reviewed the screenshots, police report login records, Kendra's timeline, and doorbell footage. She said the documentation gave us a strong basis to request a temporary civil restraining order. She explained that the initial order could be issued quickly enough to create immediate boundaries, but a later hearing would determine whether a longer order was justified. The order would prohibit Sabine from contacting me, approaching Harrison, coming near our home, or appearing at places she knew we regularly visited. Talia emphasized that an order was protection backed by legal consequences, not a physical shield. Some stalkers obeyed once the risk became clear. Others treated restrictions as a challenge. Either way, every violation had to be reported. She helped me complete the paperwork, created copies of the evidence, and gave me a dedicated folder for the hearing. She also told me to keep a handwritten incident log, recording the date, time, location, witnesses, and supporting files for every event. Her most useful advice was not legal. She said people targeted by stalking often spent enormous energy wondering whether they had overreacted because the person harming them deliberately created confusion. The log was for the judge, but it was also for me. On days when I questioned myself, I could look at the pattern and remember that my fear had a factual basis. Talia strongly recommended that I stop sharing a workplace with Sabine while the matter was active. That afternoon, I returned to the office with the police report and the restraining order paperwork. This time, I met with the head of HR, Helena Cho. Her reaction was completely different from the dismissive response I had received before. She read the report, the screenshots, and the timeline, then apologized that my original complaint had been categorized as an interpersonal disagreement. She informed me that Sabine had already been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation because 2 other women had come forward after hearing about the incident at my home. Both reported that Sabine had gone through their bags, copied files, or appeared at lunches without invitation. I was relieved that she would not be in the building, but sickened to learn that I had not been the only person she was testing. Helena offered to move me to another floor or let me work remotely until the investigation was complete. I chose remote work. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without wondering whether Sabine was behind me. Kendra came over that evening with takeout and explained what was happening at the office. News had traveled quickly. The 2 women who reported Sabine said they had doubted themselves for months because each individual incident seemed too small to justify a formal complaint. My police report gave them permission to take their own discomfort seriously. Kendra promised to testify at any hearing and handed me a cleaned-up version of her notes with dates, witnesses, and descriptions. She also warned me that not everyone believed us. Some coworkers were repeating Sabine's explanation that I was jealous and controlling, while others insisted the entire situation was a misunderstanding between friends. That response hurt more than I expected. People had watched Sabine call my husband our husband, follow him to elevators, and sit at my desk in my clothes. Yet some still preferred the easier story in which both sides were equally dramatic. Kendra said she had started shutting those conversations down by stating exactly what she had seen. We spent the evening organizing evidence in chronological order, turning 2 months of fear into a structure a judge could follow. 3 days later, Talia texted to confirm that Sabine had been served with the temporary restraining order and that the full hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The news brought relief and dread at the same time. We finally had a legal boundary, but Sabine now knew we had formally rejected the reality she had invented. The same night Sabine was served the doorbell camera recorded her car parked across the street shortly after midnight. She sat there for 20 minutes with the headlights off facing our house. She never opened the door or approached the property, but the temporary order prohibited her from coming within a specified distance of our home. I sent the footage to Detective Pike and Talia before I allowed myself to debate whether it counted. Talia called the following morning and confirmed that it was a violation. She filed the necessary report and reminded me that the purpose of the order was to make the boundary clear enough that I no longer had to interpret Sabine's intentions. If she entered the restricted area, I documented it. I did not need to prove what she planned to do while sitting in the car. By then, Sabine had also begun constructing a public version of the story in which she was the victim. She posted vague messages about betrayal, false friends, and people who could not handle the truth. She wrote about loyalty and implied that someone close to her had turned an entire workplace against her during the hardest period of her life. Anyone who knew us understood who she meant. The comments beneath her posts filled with sympathy from people who had only heard fragments. By lunchtime, several coworkers and acquaintances had contacted me. One asked whether it was true that I had tried to get Sabine fired because I was threatened by her friendship with Harrison. Another said she had heard I fabricated the police report for attention. A woman from accounting forwarded a message in which Sabine claimed I was controlling and had overreacted to harmless jokes. I sent screenshots and evidence to a few people I trusted, but quickly realized I could not personally correct every rumor. Some apologized the moment they saw the facts. Others stopped responding. The most painful message came from Simone, a coworker who sat near both of us and whom I had considered a genuine friend. She said she did not want to take sides and suggested that everyone calm down because there had probably been misunderstandings on both ends. I stared at the phrase both ends until anger replaced the hurt. There were not two equal sides. There was a woman who had entered my accounts, created a surveillance document about my husband, impersonated me, peered through my windows, and returned after police intervention. I attached 3 screenshots and replied that neutrality did not erase evidence. Then I put my phone away. Audra found me sitting on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets. She sat beside me and explained that attempts to control the story were common when someone's private behavior was exposed. Sabine needed other people to see her as the abandoned friend, rather than the person who had repeatedly violated boundaries. Audra told me not to measure the legitimacy of my fear by the number of coworkers willing to believe me. The police, my attorney Harrison Kendrick, and the witnesses had evidence. Gossip did not change it. Her words helped, but the smear campaign still invaded my thoughts at night. I kept imagining people in the office discussing my marriage, as though Sabine had ever been part of it. Harrison was struggling too. He tried working from the library, but one afternoon, a woman with hair similar to Sabine's walked past his table and triggered a panic attack. He called me from the parking lot, his voice tight and uneven. He had been unable to breathe and had left his work unfinished. He checked parking lots before walking to his car, changed his route home, and slept lightly because every sound outside reminded him that Sabine knew his routine. That night, I found him sitting behind the wheel without starting the engine. I climbed into the passenger seat and waited until he was ready to speak. He confessed that he still felt ashamed for almost believing Sabine during the first few minutes on our porch. She had sounded so caring and so certain that he had briefly wondered whether I had hidden something from him. I told him that being deceived by a practiced liar was not a betrayal. The shame belonged to the person who had deliberately used his trust against him. He said what frightened him most was not knowing where Sabine's limit was. She had already ignored social boundaries, workplace boundaries, police instructions, and a temporary order. Neither of us knew what she considered too far. We sat in the dark until his breathing slowed, then drove home in separate cars, with me following his taillights and both of us checking our mirrors. 1 week before the hearing, the camera captured a third and far more serious violation. At approximately 2 a.m, Sabine walked directly to our front door, tested the handle slowly, and left a small wrapped box on the welcome mat. We did not discover it until morning. Harrison saw it first and called me before touching anything. Inside was a printed photograph from our honeymoon placed in a frame with a handwritten note that read, "You cannot keep what was meant to be shared." I photographed the package from several angles and called Detective Pike. He arrived within half an hour, reviewed the camera footage, photographed the door and the box, and collected the frame and note as evidence. The photograph had come from the private folder Sabine accessed through my cloud account, directly connecting the physical threat at our home to the digital intrusion. Detective Pike said the repeated, restricted area visits, attempted entry, and stolen image significantly strengthened both the restraining order case and the criminal investigation. The next morning, he called to say that a warrant had been issued, and Sabine had been arrested for violating the temporary order and for unauthorized access connected to my accounts. For a few minutes, my entire body relaxed. Then, he told me her parents had posted bail. The court modified the temporary order, adding explicit restrictions against approaching me, Harrison, our home, my workplace, or places she knew we frequented. Any further violation could result in immediate arrest. Detective Pike described the stronger order as progress, but he also warned us that Sabine might retaliate now that the consequences were no longer theoretical. We kept every camera active, every door locked, and every incident log current. The 2 weeks before the hearing stretched endlessly. Talia prepared me for testimony and explained how the evidence would be presented. We arranged the material in a clear sequence: possessive comments, unwanted appearances, phone interference, the Blazer incident, computer access, stolen photographs, impersonation, unauthorized account logins, the surveillance document, the visit to our house, the anonymous message, doorbell footage, restricted area violations, and the package containing a stolen image. Kendra prepared her own statement. Lionel agreed to describe what he saw at our windows. Detective Pike organized the police reports and digital records. Harrison wrote down how Sabine's conduct affected his work sleep and ability to feel safe at home. Preparing the case was exhausting because every piece of evidence required me to re-enter the moment it represented. I reread messages I wanted to forget and watched the footage of Sabine staring at our bedroom window until her stillness felt more frightening than movement. Talia repeatedly reminded me that I did not need to diagnose Sabine or explain why she had fixated on Harrison. My job was to describe what she did, when she did it, how we responded, and why we feared continued contact. That distinction kept me grounded. I could not know what story she told herself. I knew what the camera recorded and what the account log showed. The morning of the hearing, I woke before dawn with nausea and a headache from almost no sleep. Harrison sat beside me while I dressed and reminded me that I would not be walking into the courtroom alone. Talia met us at the courthouse and reviewed the order of testimony one final time. Audra and Kendra waited nearby, and Harrison stayed close enough that I could feel his hand at the center of my back whenever my breathing became shallow. When our case was called, I saw Sabine seated beside her attorney. She wore a dark suit and kept her eyes lowered while the judge entered, but the tension in her jaw was visible from across the room. The judge was an older woman with a controlled, attentive manner. Talia began by presenting the timeline and emphasizing that the case did not rest on one uncomfortable joke or one disputed encounter. It rested on a documented pattern supported by screenshots, account records, witness statements, police reports, physical evidence, and video footage. When I took the stand, my voice shook at first. I described the first "our husband" comments and how Sabine dismissed my objections. I explained the unexpected appearances at private outings, the way she followed Harrison to the elevator, and the office party where she took my phone. I described finding her in my blazer at my desk with Harrison trapped against the cubicle wall. Then I explained the honeymoon photographs, the fake breakup email, the note on my monitor, and the message sent from my phone while I slept. I told the judge how Sabine left the office and arrived at our house before I could reach Harrison, how she peered through our windows, and how calmly she tried to convince him that I had sent her. I described the unfamiliar logins and the document listing Harrison's routes, schedule, family coffee order, and private anniversary plans. Finally, Talia displayed the camera footage Sabine staring at our bedroom window, sitting across the street after being served, testing the front door, and leaving the box containing our stolen photograph. Speaking through the entire sequence forced me to hear just how far the behavior had traveled. From an inappropriate joke, Sabine's attorney tried to frame the situation as a friendship that had been misinterpreted during a period of emotional instability following a divorce. She suggested that Sabine had become overly involved because she believed I was struggling, and that some of the workplace exchanges were mutual jokes. She asked whether I had laughed the first time Sabine called Harrison "our husband." I answered honestly that I hadn't, because the comment surprised me and because people often laugh when they are uncomfortable. I also stated that I later told Sabine directly to stop. The attorney implied that Sabine's visits to restaurants and markets could have been coincidences. Talia responded with the calendar access location data, repeated messages asking where we were going, and Kendra's dated notes. Kendra testified about seeing Sabine at my desk, trying on my blazer, watching the lobby feed, and speaking about Harrison when she believed no one was listening. Lionel testified that Sabine had peered through our windows and refused multiple requests to leave. Detective Pike described the police response, the digital evidence, the restricted area violations, and the photograph recovered from the package. Harrison explained how Sabine knew information he had never shared with her and how the fear had affected his work and daily life. When Sabine's attorney attempted to minimize the package as a misguided gesture, Detective Pike noted that it had been left at 2 in the morning after Sabine tested the handle of a home she had been legally ordered to avoid. The judge asked Sabine's attorney several direct questions about the account logins and surveillance document. The answers were vague. Sabine did not testify, and for most of the hearing, she avoided looking at me. After reviewing the final documents, the judge stated that the evidence demonstrated repeated escalating conduct that caused a reasonable fear for our safety. She granted a restraining order lasting 5 years. Sabine was required to remain at least 500 feet away from me, Harrison, our home, my workplace, and locations she knew we visited regularly. She could not contact us directly through anonymous accounts or through other people. Any violation could lead to immediate arrest and additional criminal consequences. Relief moved through me so suddenly that my knees felt weak. I had spent weeks wondering whether the legal system would treat the pattern as seriously as we did. Now the boundary was written, clearly backed by the court, and no longer dependent on whether a coworker considered Sabine's behavior strange enough. Then I looked across the room. Sabine was staring directly at me. The expression on her face was not grief or embarrassment. It was cold, focused hatred. She did not blink when I met her eyes. Talia quietly touched my arm and told me we would use a side exit. As we gathered our papers, I heard Sabine say something sharp to her attorney, but I could not make out the words. Outside, Harrison, Audra, and Kendra were waiting on the courthouse steps. I nodded to tell them the order had been granted, and Harrison pulled me into a hug so tightly that I could barely breathe. Kendra made a quiet joke about never again being polite to the wrong person, and for the first time in weeks, we all laughed without forcing it. Still, I told Audra about Sabine's expression. Audra reminded me that the order was protection, not a guarantee. We needed to keep the cameras, locks, check-ins, and incident log. Winning the hearing did not require us to forget what Sabine had already ignored. We went to lunch after court, but celebration felt difficult. Mostly, I was exhausted. For 2 months, every normal part of life had become evidence or risk a lunch delivery, a running route, an anniversary plan, a text message, a photograph, a front door. Harrison kept his hand on my back throughout the meal, and Kendra raised a glass to boundaries being taken seriously before anyone had to prove danger through tragedy. That night, I slept for almost 6 uninterrupted hours, the longest stretch since Sabine first appeared at our house. I still checked the camera before bed and woke once to inspect the lock, but the court order had given my mind something solid to hold. Over the following weeks, the criminal case continued. Talia remained in contact with the prosecutor and explained each development in plain language. 3 months after the restraining order was granted, she called to say the charges had been resolved through a plea agreement. Sabine received probation rather than jail time, but the conditions were strict. She was required to attend regular treatment with a clinician experienced in obsessive behavior, report to a probation officer every 2 weeks, comply with the restraining order, and avoid all contact with us. The company completed its internal investigation and terminated her employment. She was permanently barred from the building. The prosecutor believed mandated treatment and close supervision offered a better chance of preventing future escalation than a short jail sentence followed by release without structure. I was relieved that I would not have to testify in a second trial, but Talia warned me not to confuse a plea with remorse. Sabine might have accepted the terms simply to avoid a harsher outcome. The order remained in effect regardless of whether she believed she had done anything wrong. During the first month after the hearing our camera recorded, Sabine's car passing slowly along our street, once in the early evening. She did not stop, but I saved the clip and reported it. After that, the visit ceased. Detective Pike believed the combination of arrest, probation, camera evidence, job loss, and treatment requirements finally made continued contact too costly. I hoped he was right, but I did not dismantle our safety measures. We kept the deadbolts, motion light camera, 2-factor authentication, and private location sharing. I continued checking the lock before bed, though. Eventually, the habit stopped feeling like panic and began to feel like ordinary care. Harrison returned to working from home only after several quiet weeks. At first, he kept the doorbell feed open on a second monitor and looked at it every time a car slowed outside. Gradually, he checked less often. His concentration improved and the panic attacks became less frequent, but neither of us pretended the experience had disappeared simply because Sabine had stopped showing up. I began seeing a therapist, Dr. Farah Rahman, every other week. In the first sessions, I kept circling the same questions. Why had I not reported Sabine earlier? Why had I laughed at the first comment? Why had I allowed her to stand near Harrison, access my schedule, or behave as though our private plans were invitations? I blamed myself for not recognizing the danger while it was still small. Dr. Rahman explained that people who violate boundaries rarely begin with the most frightening act. They test what will be tolerated, then move the line in small increments. One possessive joke can be dismissed. An unexpected appearance can be called coincidence. Trying on a blazer can be framed as strange humor. By the time the acts form an obvious pattern, the person being targeted has already spent weeks explaining each one away. She told me that hindsight creates the illusion that the entire path was visible from the beginning. It was not. At the time, I saw individual moments, each surrounded by coworkers who did not react strongly, and an HR department that initially told me to handle the conflict myself. The pattern became unmistakable only after Sabine's behavior accelerated and the evidence connected the pieces. Dr. Rahman did not let me use that explanation to avoid examining boundaries, but she also refused to let me carry responsibility for Sabine's choices. I could learn from what happened without pretending I had caused it. The anger was more difficult than the guilt. I was furious that Sabine had taken something healthy in my life and made it feel unsafe. Harrison had once been able to bring me coffee without checking who might be watching. He had worked peacefully at home without wondering whether someone knew his route or stood outside the window. Our honeymoon photographs had been private memories. My messages with friends and family had been places where I could speak freely. Sabine invaded all of it, then tried to portray herself as the person who had been betrayed. Dr. Rahman told me anger was an appropriate response to violation, but I needed to decide what I did with it. She helped me identify the moments when anger protected me by reinforcing a boundary, and the moments when it kept me mentally trapped in arguments Sabine would never hear. I practiced grounding exercises for sudden fear, naming what I could see, reminding myself of the current date and location, checking facts rather than following imagined scenarios, and allowing my body time to come out of alarm. The work was exhausting. Some sessions left me feeling raw for the rest of the day, but over time, I stopped judging myself for having reactions that made sense after months of surveillance. Underneath the fear and anger was a grief I had been embarrassed to admit. Sabine had not always been a stranger to me. Before the fixation became visible, she had been someone I ate lunch with, complained about deadlines with, and trusted enough to introduce to Harrison. I had believed we were friends, or at least friendly coworkers. Discovering that she had used access to my life as material for surveillance made me question every earlier interaction. I replayed conversations and wondered when genuine friendliness had become observation. Dr. Rahman told me I was allowed to grieve the relationship I believed existed, while also being grateful that the real relationship was over. Both could be true. I did not miss the person who stood outside my window, but I mourned the version of Sabine I had thought I knew. That grief was part of accepting that there would probably never be an explanation that made her actions reasonable. Harrison and I also had to rebuild the ordinary rhythm of our marriage. We talked more honestly than we had before, not because our relationship had been weak, but because fear had exposed how easily two people could carry private guilt. He admitted that he sometimes felt responsible for attracting Sabine's attention simply by being kind at the office. I reminded him that making coffee, fixing a machine, or remembering birthdays did not invite obsession. He reminded me that sharing a workplace with her did not make me responsible for giving her access to our lives. We discussed the few minutes when he almost believed her on the porch, until neither of us treated that moment as a secret shame. Sabine had selected details from my private messages, spoken calmly, and presented herself as my concerned representative. The deception was designed to create doubt. What mattered was that Harrison questioned the inconsistencies, refused to let her inside, and stood beside me once the evidence was clear. We began making normal plans again, turning the spare room into a proper office, taking a weekend trip and visiting friends without checking whether Sabine had access to the calendar. At first, those plans felt fragile, as though saying them aloud might expose them. Gradually, they became what plans had been before, simple possibilities in a shared future. Kendra and I stayed close. The two women from the other team who had reported Sabine began joining us for coffee. Each of us had a different collection of incidents that seemed minor until placed beside the others. One woman described finding the contents of her bag rearranged. The other had repeatedly seen Sabine at lunches she had never been invited to attend. None of them had wanted to be labeled dramatic. We talked about how much social pressure encourages people to remain polite, even when their instincts warn them. A friendly smile and a plate of food had earned Sabine an enormous amount of benefit of the doubt. Her gradual escalation allowed everyone around her to normalize behavior that would have seemed alarming if it had happened all at once. Our conversations did not turn into constant analysis of Sabine. Most of the time, we discussed work families and ordinary frustrations. Still, there was comfort in being around people who understood why a strange comment or unexpected appearance could affect me long after the immediate danger ended. Several months later, I joined a support group for people who had experienced stalking. The meetings took place in a private room at a community center, and I spent the first session listening more than speaking. One woman described an ex-partner who accepted a breakup publicly, then began appearing near her work and home. A man spoke about a former colleague who became fixated after one project and gradually inserted himself into every part of his schedule. Different stories contained the same self-doubt. Nearly everyone had asked why they had not understood sooner. The facilitator reminded us that boundary testing is effective because each step is calibrated to remain explainable. The target is encouraged to question perception, while the person escalating learns what consequences, if any, follow. Recognizing the pattern afterward did not mean we had failed. It meant we now had knowledge we had not possessed at the beginning. Hearing that from people who had lived through similar experiences eased a loneliness I had not known how to describe. At one meeting, the facilitator asked what had helped people sleep again. A woman across the circle said she improved only after accepting that she would never receive the apology or explanation she had been waiting for. She had imagined that one day, the person who harmed her would become clear-minded, admit everything, and give her a reason that made the experience comprehensible. Waiting for that moment kept her emotionally connected to someone who had already taken too much. Her words stayed with me. A small part of me had imagined Sabine eventually contacting me through legal channels, remorseful and able to explain why she chose Harrison, why she wanted my place, or why she believed our husband could become real if she repeated it enough. But no explanation could transform surveillance into affection or impersonation into friendship. Closure would not come from Sabine agreeing with my version of reality. It would come from living without needing her agreement. When I shared that realization at the next meeting, several people nodded before I finished. Their recognition made the thought feel less like something I was trying to convince myself to believe, and more like a truth I could practice. I returned to the office several months after the internal investigation ended, and Sabine had been gone long enough that the building no longer felt like an extension of her presence. On my first morning back, I paused in the lobby and realized I was scanning every face. I knew she was barred from the property and still under court order, but my body reacted before my mind could reassure it. Helena had moved my desk and adjusted my access, so I no longer worked in the same area where most of the incidents occurred. Kendra met me by the elevators and walked upstairs with me without making the gesture feel like supervision. My new desk was ordinary, which was exactly what I needed. I could take a call from Harrison without lowering my voice. I could leave my computer long enough to collect coffee, though I locked it every time out of habit. I could focus on a client document without watching the lobby camera in the corner of someone else's screen. My work had suffered while I was frightened and exhausted, but concentration returned faster than I expected once the immediate threat was absent. My manager told me she was glad to have me back and acknowledged that the company should have responded more seriously to my first report. The apology did not undo what happened, but hearing the failure named mattered. On my second day back, Simone approached my desk. She looked uncomfortable and spoke quietly enough that no one nearby could hear. She said she had reviewed the court records and realized she had been wrong to describe the situation as a misunderstanding. She apologized for telling me she did not want to take sides when I needed support. The older version of me would have rushed to comfort her, minimizing my own hurt, so she would not have to sit with the consequences of her neutrality. Instead, I thanked her for apologizing and let the silence remain. I did not tell her it was fine, because it had not been fine. I did not punish her either. I simply accepted the apology and returned to work. That small moment felt like evidence of change. I no longer believed that protecting other people from discomfort was more important than protecting myself. The two women who had reported Sabine also stopped by. We went to lunch together and, although no one said it directly, there was solidarity in knowing each of us had once questioned whether we were imagining the same danger. Dr. Rahman warned me that hypervigilance could continue after the threat decreased. My nervous system had spent months scanning for Sabine, and it would not immediately accept a quiet period as proof of safety. She was right. For a long time, my heart accelerated when I saw someone with Sabine's build or haircut. At a grocery store, a woman in a cardigan similar to one Sabine often wore turned into my aisle, and I experienced a full surge of panic before I saw her face. My hands went cold, my hearing narrowed, and I abandoned the cart for several minutes. Later, I felt embarrassed until Dr. Rahman reminded me that my body had responded to a pattern associated with real danger. The goal was not to shame the response away, but to teach my brain to update. I practiced identifying the differences between the present and the past. I was in a public store. Harrison knew where I was. The woman was not Sabine. No one was following me. I had a phone, an exit, and a plan. Over the months, those responses came less often and faded more quickly. Harrison and I developed quiet routines that helped without allowing fear to run our lives. When we entered a restaurant, he took the chair facing away from the door, so I could see the entrance without asking. If my phone buzzed late at night, he glanced at the screen first when he was awake. We kept the camera but stopped watching it continuously. One evening, I realized I had gone an entire day without opening the app. The discovery was so small that no one else would have noticed, yet it felt like a victory. Recovery did not arrive as a dramatic moment when all fear disappeared. It appeared in ordinary evidence sleeping through the night, leaving the house without checking the street twice, laughing in a crowded room before scanning every face and allowing Harrison to go for a run without tracking every minute. The good days gradually outnumbered the bad ones until ordinary life stopped feeling like something we had to manufacture. Audra called one Tuesday afternoon, sounding excited and emotional. She had completed her counseling degree and been accepted into a specialized trauma program. She told me that helping us navigate the stalking situation had clarified the kind of work she wanted to do. She had seen how confusing legal systems, workplace responses, and trauma reactions could become when someone's safety was violated. She wanted to support people who needed an advocate capable of understanding both practical risk and emotional aftermath. I was proud of her and grateful that something constructive had grown out of an experience none of us would have chosen. Audra told me I had been braver than I believed. Not because I had recognized Sabine immediately, but because I kept acting after others minimized the problem. I had returned to HR with documentation, filed reports, followed legal advice, testified, and continued protecting Harrison and myself, even when gossip made me doubt whether the effort was worth it. Her description did not match how I had felt at the time. I had felt frightened, disorganized, and exhausted. Dr. Rahman later told me, courage rarely feels composed from inside the person living it. Sometimes courage is simply continuing while afraid. A year after the restraining order was granted, I walked into the office without searching the lobby for Sabine's face. I noticed only after reaching my desk. The tension I had carried in my shoulders was no longer constant. I still saw Dr. Rahman occasionally because healing was not linear, and certain situations could still pull me backward for a day or two. Most of the time, however, my worries had returned to ordinary scale. Deadlines, bills, dinner plans, and whether Harrison would finish the spare room shelves before our next guests arrived. The doorbell camera became a tool rather than an obsession. The incident folder remained backed up in several places, but I no longer opened it unless Talia or Detective Pike requested something. The restraining order still had years remaining, and we continued treating it seriously. Safety and peace were no longer opposites. I could keep sensible protections without allowing Sabine to occupy every thought. Harrison and I finally took the trip we had discussed throughout recovery. We chose a town about 4 hours away where neither of us had been and where no part of our routine was familiar to Sabine. We left on a Friday afternoon with the windows partly open and music playing, carrying no agenda beyond checking into the hotel and deciding what looked interesting. During the first hour, I caught myself checking the side mirror whenever a car remained behind us for more than a few miles. Harrison noticed, but did not comment. By the second hour, I had stopped. We walked through the old downtown that evening, entered shops without planning exits, and ate at a small restaurant where no one knew our names. I chose a table that let me see the door, but I did not spend the meal watching it. Harrison talked about a design project, and I laughed at something he said without first checking the room. The normality of it moved me more than any grand celebration could have. A year earlier, a restaurant had been one of the places where Sabine might appear smiling as though coincidence entitled her to join us. Now it was simply a restaurant, in a town far from home, and Harrison was simply my husband sitting across from me. That night in the hotel room, we talked about how close the experience had come to changing the way we saw each other. Sabine had tried to use access, doubt, and fear to turn our marriage into something unstable enough for her to enter. She impersonated me because she wanted Harrison to question my words. She collected his routines because she wanted proximity without permission. She referred to him as our husband because repeating ownership allowed her to pretend a shared relationship existed. For a few minutes on the porch, her strategy almost worked. The fact that it failed was not because Harrison and I possessed some perfect, unbreakable bond. It failed because the inconsistencies became visible, because witnesses documented what happened, because we communicated, and because we chose evidence over manipulation. Harrison told me he was proud that I kept pursuing the case after the first HR response dismissed me. I apologized again for the fear he experienced in his own home, and he stopped me. He said Sabine was responsible for that fear, not me. Then he apologized for the guilt he had carried after briefly doubting me, and I reminded him that doubt manufactured through stolen information was exactly what Sabine intended. We had repeated those truths before, but this time, they felt settled rather than rehearsed. When I look back now, the earliest warning signs seem obvious because I know where they led. At the time, they did not arrive labeled as stalking. They arrived as jokes, awkward compliments, an unwanted conversation, an unexpected meeting at a market, and a coworker who seemed lonely after a painful divorce. I learned that compassion does not require abandoning judgment. Someone can be hurting and still be responsible for the harm they cause. I can understand that Sabine was struggling without granting her access to my husband, my accounts, my home, or my forgiveness. I learned that a boundary is not an accusation. Saying, "Do not call him our husband," should have been enough because discomfort itself was sufficient reason. I did not need to wait until she copied photographs or stood outside my window to justify the word no. I learned that documentation is not dramatic when a pattern is forming. Dates, screenshots, witness notes, login histories, and camera footage turned an experience people could minimize into evidence institutions had to address. More importantly, the records protected me from my own doubt. Whenever gossip or politeness tempted me to soften what happened, I could look at the sequence and remember that Sabine's actions were not accidental. I also learned that institutions often respond to the clarity of documentation rather than the intensity of fear. My first complaint to HR was dismissed because I described behavior that sounded uncomfortable but had not yet been assembled into a formal pattern. That response was inadequate, and Helena acknowledged it. When I returned with police reports, account logs, witness notes, and the false email, the company acted. The lesson was not that I should have needed so much proof. The lesson was that when an institution fails to understand, I am allowed to return with evidence, ask for escalation, and seek outside protection. Being dismissed once does not make the danger less real. It means the response was insufficient. The experience changed the way I think about kindness. Before Sabine, I believed kindness often meant smoothing over awkward moments, giving people generous explanations, and avoiding embarrassment. I still value generosity, but I no longer confuse it with access. I can be compassionate without answering invasive questions. I can be professional without sharing my location. I can accept an apology without telling the person they did nothing wrong. I can end a conversation without securing everyone's approval. The ability to let another person remain uncomfortable is one of the most practical forms of self-protection I learned. Sabina counted on people not wanting to make a scene. She counted on coworkers describing her actions as joke, loneliness, or drama. Once we stopped protecting her from the consequences of her own behavior, her control began to collapse. Our home belongs to us again in a way I once feared it never would. Harrison works in the office we created in the spare room, surrounded by plans, samples, and the shelves he eventually finished. I can hear him moving around while I make coffee, without wondering whether someone is watching from the street. Kendra comes for dinner, and our conversations are about office politics, terrible television, and whatever project Harrison is pretending will take only one weekend. Audra visits when her program allows, and sometimes she talks about the work she hopes to do with people, rebuilding a sense of safety. We still lock the doors, we still maintain the camera, and protect our passwords. Those habits no longer mean Sabine owns part of our attention. They mean we learned how to care for the life we value. The last time Detective Pike contacted me, he confirmed that there had been no new reported violations, and that Sabine remained under supervision. Talia reminded me to keep the order and documentation accessible, but neither of them expected me to organize my life around the possibility of her return. That distinction mattered. Preparedness meant knowing what to do if something happened. Fear meant living as though it already had. I chose preparedness. I stopped searching anonymous profiles for hidden messages. I stopped asking coworkers whether they had heard Sabine's name. I stopped rehearsing imaginary confrontations in which she finally admitted that everything had been wrong. She was no longer entitled to an ongoing trial inside my head. Sometimes people ask what the moment was when I knew we were safe again. There was no single moment. It was the first night Harrison slept without waking at a car door closing. It was the first run he completed without changing his route halfway through. It was the first office lunch where I left my phone on the table and did not think about who might touch it. It was Simone's apology accepted without me taking responsibility for her comfort. It was driving 4 hours away and realizing halfway there that I had stopped checking the mirror. It was 100 ordinary moments in which Sabine did not appear, and eventually her absence stopped being the main thing I noticed. I am not grateful for what happened. I do not believe trauma is valuable merely because people sometimes grow after surviving it. I would undo the fear the account intrusion, the court hearings, and the nights spent watching the camera if I could. But I am proud of what Harrison and I built in response. Our marriage is more honest because we learned to speak about fear before shame could isolate us. My friendships are stronger because I know who will stand beside me when politeness becomes dangerous. My boundaries are clearer because I no longer wait for someone else to agree that I am uncomfortable. I trust my instincts without treating every uneasy feeling as proof, and I gather facts without talking myself out of what those facts show. Sabine once behaved as though calling Harrison our husband could make the phrase true. It never did. Harrison was never shared, never hers, and never part of the relationship she invented. What she took from us was privacy time and a sense of safety, and recovering those things required more work than I imagined. But she did not take our marriage. She did not take our home. She did not take my ability to decide who has access to my life. Today, when Harrison walks into my office with coffee or sends me a message about dinner, I no longer hear Sabine's voice attached to the moment. I hear only the person I chose speaking to the person who chose him back. Our life is ours again, and this time I understand that protecting it is not cruelty. It is love.